Hello, hobby friends. This is part 2 of me working on overly involved bases for my larger Tyranid models. Last time, I worked on the 40mm bases. Only the largest bases are left, plus 2 small ones. I think I'll work on the flying tentacle ones first. Something you may have noticed is that there was nothing to attach this model to the base. There was an angled sewer pipe that the tentacles were drifting over, but my bugs are on a barren battlefield, so a random pipe doesn't make much sense to me. I'd show you the pipe, but I already gave it to a friend. So here's a picture of the studio model. I could use clear flight stands, but I think I'll go with clay instead. The plan is to mount this Xenos jellyfish by the shorter tentacle. That way the 2 longer ones will give the illusion of hovering by hanging below the attachment point. I put the clay piece on the base to get a visual for the overall composition. This will end up being a tall rock protruding from an uneven landscape. Then I measure it so I can double check the height during the sculpting process. I thought about mounting the clay onto my normal clay mounting discs, but I'll have more room on a plastic base. And because it's on the same base that it will eventually be glued onto, I can add this long base rim extension and know that it has the exact right curvature. I blend the tall piece into the rim by layering additional pieces of clay between them. These extra pieces also help to give an interesting silhouette to the jutting rock face. I measure it to make sure the height is unchanged, then I get to texturing with a rock, fitting extra pieces as I see fit. I also use a softer clay to fill a couple of the gaps, though I usually smooth the gaps with the rock while applying texture. And with that, the rock is finished. I slice it off its base like a 3D print off its building plate. Except I don't actually have a 3D printer, so I don't know why I made that comparison. I place the piece onto an aluminum sheet for baking. Can't have uncured clay on the base, so I scrape it off with these handy-dandy scrapers built right into my fingers. Tweezers, part separators, I'm always finding new uses for my fingernails. Speaking of finding things, I just found out that this base fits perfectly into the lid of the container I use for my baking soda. This has nothing to do with the project, I just get easily distracted. Clay's baked. The oven keeps melting the adhesive on the rims of these floppy disk discs. Hopefully it's nothing to be concerned about. I reattach the rocky structure to the base with superglue, though it did take more than one attempt. I use a paper clip to smear superglue along the base rim to fill any remaining gaps between the base and the clay. Then, I use my hobby knife to remove the overhanging clay. The overhang is so thick that I had to make more than one pass for safety reasons. This large overhanging part required more special attention and careful cutting. I sanded the clay smooth and moved on to some small clay rocks and base rim extensions. This base is built and ready for attachment. As I look at the Neurotyrant with the base, I decide to flip the middle tentacle, or tail, by mirror imaging it. I accomplished this by heating it over a candle and bending it. I think it looks way better with the tail moved away from the rock support. However, a side effect of this process is that I sort of melted the end of the tail. Not only that, but there is now a curvy seam line wrapping around the tail about halfway down. I think that this seam line is where the plastic ran into itself during the ejection process, and heating and bending pulled away the plastic, opening this micro trench. Should be a simple fix. As for the tail tip, I actually have a second copy of this model since I bought the Tyranid half of the Leviathan box from a friend. But instead of taking the tail tip from this Tyranid, I'm just going to make a copy. Now, this is my first time making a mold of something that's still on sprue, but the process should be the same. For this, I'm using Oyamaru. I'm not going to go into detail here since I covered it in part 1, but I will note that I used Vaseline as a mold release to keep the 2 halves of the mold from sticking together. Once the mold halves were solidified, I peeled them off and pressed in some polymer clay. It won't be perfect, but this clay replacement should look way better than the melted original. On the topic of molding things, I got this old Imperial Guard Sentinel in an eBay lot a while back. It was a medium-sized lot containing 2nd and 3rd edition 40k Space Marines, and also this one Sentinel for some reason. It very much looks like it was built and painted by a curing 3rd edition, probably why it was so cheap. The whole lot was about $40. But the real price for cheap models is the time it takes to fix them up. And this model definitely needs to be disassembled if I want to fix it up or even just copy the parts. The fact that this Sentinel was assembled with plastic cement only makes this more tedious. Seriously, if you ever try this for yourself, have a lot of patience and be very careful. The knee joints on this thing are practically screaming hospital trip. Though not all the pieces were so hard to remove. Thank God. Made the copies. Now, as cool as these clay copies look, I have to get back to the tail. I actually made 3 copies of the tail, that way I could choose the best looking one. I selected the best and cleaned it up. It's looking pretty good, I think. Now to attach it. I figure out where to cut it, then I cut it. I drill a hole and insert a section of paperclip for pinning. I dab off the excess superglue and slide on the tail. After some minor orientational adjustments, the tail looks pretty good. The final step is to gap fill the seam where the clay meets the plastic. If it were a plastic-to-plastic bond, I would gap fill with sprue glue, but since the replacement part is made of polymer clay, superglue will have to do. There is still a noticeable gap in the backside, so I wedge in a wedge-shaped clay offcut. I trim the material down, but the superglue looks not fully solidified. As I wait for it to dry, I move on to one of the baby bugs. These ones are pretty simple. I drill a hole and insert a paperclip so I can pin them to more clay rocks that I made earlier. In order to make them look like they're floating, I attach them to the rocks in places that are not the lowest part of the mini. The idea is that if part of the mini hangs below the attachment point, it won't look structurally sound, thus resulting in the illusion that it must be held up by some other force. AKA, it looks like it's flying. With the glue on the tail dried, I carve away the excess. Then I smooth the transition with a skinny file. I usually don't have a need for this kind of file, but in situations like this, it's indispensable. I take some opaque miniature paint and apply it to the joint so I can inspect how smooth it is. Looking smooth. With the tail tailored, I can finally get to fixing this model to its base. It's pretty much the same as the baby bugs, but I want to be absolutely sure that I have it in the exact position I want. If I'm not careful in the positioning, I could end up with a slightly uncentered mini that will bug me for the rest of time. Once I have the hole drilled, I test fit the paperclip. When pinning, the holes can be at completely different orientations, as long as the mouths of each hole line up. Being able to have a bent pin opens up a plethora of pinning opportunities. I hit up the paperclip with a metal file to add some tooth. Then I glue it in, making sure to check the angle throughout the process. I test fit it on the base and glue it in place. Again, I'm double checking and making adjustments before the glue completely dries. The attachment looks pretty solid. I think I'm satisfied with this, though it's a little bouncy. The first of these big bugs is based. So, I was out exercising one time, and I saw this large millipede. Since this is a bug video, I figured I'd show it to you. Ah, it's so cute walking over that rocky terrain. Speaking of rocky terrain, let's base more bugs! Next up is the Sreamer-Killer, the real meat and potatoes of the video. Or should I say pork and beans? For this, I need my hardy nippers, and also this plastic saw. Using my hardy nippers, I remove the block under the right hoof. However, I'm now faced with a new problem. That's not going to be fun to fix. Now I could use some sprue glue, the thicker cement, but instead I'll go with superglue. Superglue is less structurally stable than cement in the long run, but it dries way faster. Plus, if the legs split after an application of thick cement, who's to say it won't happen again? Because I used superglue, I need to reinforce the inside of the leg to avoid future splitting. The first step is to score hatch marks on the inside of the leg. These will create a texture that will help the internal supports adhere later. I mean, just look how well the superglue adheres to the texture of my skin. Seriously, it's not coming off. I sand a piece of plastic card to give it a rough texture as well. Then I cut it into smaller pieces. I bent one of the pieces, put some glue on it, and press it into place. It wasn't bent enough, but that's nothing some brute force can't fix. Just gotta keep the pressure while the glue is drying. The plate in the back was much easier to apply. I cut and shaved a piece of Games Workshop sprue into this specific shape and plug it into the leg cavity. I placed another plug, but this one didn't quite fit right. To lock it in place, I dumped some baking soda on it to help solidify the glue between the ajar surfaces. I fill the remaining gaps and get to sawing. Another tool I almost never use. But when I need it, I need it. The saw did a pretty good job, but I still need to continue flattening with a hobby knife. Here, I'm using the thumb pushing technique to generate a lot of force in a safe, controlled manner. My thumb can't push the blade all the way across the surface of the hoof, so I'm attacking from multiple angles. I finish it with a low grit nail file. This has the bonus effect of creating a texture that, you guessed it, will help the superglue adhere. Now I have a Sreamer-Killer with one leg in the air like he's tap dancing. The next step is to add an interesting element to the base, like this guard sentinel. I try out different orientations for the cab of the walker, but I think I'll go with this position. That way, the walker's legs can extend onto the base. Of course, why would I use a perfectly good walker on this base when I can just copy it? And I already made the parts. Now, whoever assembled this walker, probably a kid, did not align the sections of the cab properly. But because the copy is made of polymer clay, it's not too difficult to cut straight through it. Due to the casting process, my casting process, this piece has a couple extra ridges between the armor plates. Again, it's pretty simple to carve these away. I also hollow out this window. With the pieces prepped, I glue them back together. And this time, they are aligned. You can see how misaligned it was just from looking at the back. Now, because there was some overlap between the molds I made, I need to cut the front off of this side piece, and the side off of this front piece. After some off-screen beveling, I think I have a nice fit. Then I glue them. It's taken a bit of work, but it's really starting to look like a 3D copy. When I was making the clay parts, I rolled out this flat piece of clay. The back has a weird texture from the tin foil, well, aluminum foil, but I just won't show that part in the finished build. I cut a small rectangular piece to form the roof of the cab. Not every part has to be a direct copy. And the reason I'm using clay instead of plastic card for this is because of how easy and fast it is to cut it. Now, you might be wondering why I didn't mold the whole body as one piece. Well, that's because 1, I didn't have enough Oyamaru, and 2, because I have to take the clay out of the mold before it's hardened, means that the casting process results in less warping when the part is shallow. Though I'm now wondering if resin would actually work better for large things. With things like this undercarriage assembly, as long as I clean up the seam between the two halves, no one will ever know that the part was formed from two different parts. In fact, that sentinel sentiment applies to the whole build. Here, I'm working on this foothold, stoop kind of thing on the side behind the cab. It's a bit skinnier than the original, but again, I doubt anyone will ever notice. They will, however, notice if I don't make these parts flush. This, again, is why the softer nature of polymer clay comes in handy. Or at least the kind I'm using. In a build like this, being able to cut anything easily at a moment's notice goes a long way to streamlining the process as a whole. And in case you're curious, the clay I'm using is Sculpey Premo. Behind the cab, there is a small standing area. To make this, I superglue a section of aluminum mesh to another clay rectangle thing. This mesh is comprised of a bunch of loose woven wires, so without the glued backing, the small bits of wire at the corners would likely come off. With the addition of this floor piece, the body is looking pretty close to being done. But there's still a long way to go. The next part is to make the array of lights and sensors atop the body. I'm using armature wire to pin some pieces of Gundam Runner together. Mecha models and Gunpla have round channels for the plastic to flow through. One Gundam kit and you have countless cylinder sections. To mount the lights and stuff, I'm using a few offcuts of polymer clay. I slowly build up the structure, adding more parts to try and mimic the original design, including this wire that runs from the back to the larger light on top of the assembly. I finish it off with some tiny details made from more clay offcuts. It's not an exact translation, but it looks pretty close. Definitely made on a different Forge world. To attach it to the body, I drill a hole in some plastic card and glue in another length of Gundam runner. I cut it out and glue it to the underside of the assembly. I drill a hole in the roof of the cabin and plug in the new sensor array, or whatever it is. Yup, this copy is looking closer and closer to the original. Moving on to the hips, I use the existing body as a guide for where to drill the hole for the attachment point, and double check with the original hip assembly. I call it an assembly, but it's only like 2 pieces. After drilling the hole, I glued a chunky offcut inside to stabilize the pivot shaft. The pivot shaft. Then I test the fit of the pivot shaft. It won't go in all the way, so I drill it out some more. For the pivot shaft. Every time I complete another piece of this build, there is this sizable sense of satisfaction. Oh, and I can't forget about the lights. Having the light assembly be a sub-assembly helps to prevent damage during the assembly. Speaking of the lights, I decided to add a second wire because the first one looked too lonely. Continuing with the body build, I add a couple of half cylinders to the inside of the back. They're not cut exactly straight, but whatever. These will form the foundation for the smokestacks. The stacks themselves are the kind of detail that would probably come out wonky if I tried to duplicate them, so scratch building it is. This is just another clay cylinder. Using a gel pen, I mark all of the places I want to drill holes. I decided to make them off screen so I could watch some TV while also working on the project. But here they are. The SpongeBob tubes. Each has 22 holes. And yeah, it took me a while to make these. To mount them, I yet again drill more holes. That's sort of become a theme with this build. I place the pegs and snip them to size. I'd suppose I could have used wire instead of plastic pegs though. I glued them down, but then realized I glued them down 45 degrees apart rotationally. Oops. I don't think enough glue got around the base of one of these SpongeBob tubes, so I apply more. Here, I have a rounded corner section of a Gundam runner that I sanded smooth on one side, because it wasn't smooth. After more cutting and drilling, I have these 2 pieces to put on the tubes. Oh, and if you're wondering why one of them turned pink, that's because I dropped one and had to make a replacement off-screen because I couldn't find it. It could have been worse though. I could have lost a SpongeBob tube. God forbid someone loses a SpongeBob tube. So, I have the whole body for the walker done now. And I think it's about time to get back to the model this build was for. Remember how this was supposed to be a Tyranid video? I drill a hole in the plastic filling I made earlier. Remember, the best way to drill a hole is to work your way up in size. Don't read into that. I think I want Mr. Nids to be stepping on this part of the body. Let's take a chance and just drill a hole. Now, the hole is a bit further back than I'd like. But before I can drill a repositioned hole, I need to plug the first one. If I don't, then the second hole will drift into the first one and that will be a real problem. Once the hole is filled, I drill again. Don't read into that. Okay, now we're getting somewhere. And because I used a peg connection, I'm free to adjust the orientation of the walker for the perfect pose. The walker isn't sitting quite flat, so I take a little off the back. With Mr. Nids now raised up by the walker, there is a subtle gap under its left leg. Can't leave Mr. Nids hanging, so I'll have to bridge the gap with a rocky plateau made of clay. There's a small problem though. I'm all out of Sculpey Premo, and I don't feel like going to the store for more. I guess I could use Sculpey III. Oh wait, I got some FIMO, never mind. I've actually had this block of FIMO since before I got into painting miniatures. As a middle schooler, this is one of those things I had my parents buy for me at a store they took me to and then never used. I did finally open it as an adult, over a decade later. This clay is really tough, so let's add in some Sculpey III to make it softer. Sculpey III is the softest clay I own, but it's also the most brittle. And you know what? Let's add some of this DOS clay. In addition to the novelty of mixing 3 different brands of clay, this DOS clay will add properties like that of Sculpey Premo, which is what the body of this walker is made of. The only issue I found with DOS clay is that the details sometimes soften in the oven. Instead of making a giant clay spacer, I'm going to make multiple rock textured pieces and piece them together into a single piece. Here, I'm using a Gatorade bottle cap as a form to support the clay during the texturing process. That way I can get a curved piece. While the bits are baking, I get to work on the structure that will support the left leg. This will be similar to what I did in my previous video, where I attached bits of plastic sprue under the model's feet as stilts and built up the terrain around them. Only here, I'm cementing many lengths of sprue together to make the mega stilt. It's actually fun tessellating these trapezoids. I cover the ends in sprue glue to fill any gaps. There will be no weak links under my watch. Speaking of sprues, let's use one to reinforce the bottom of the base. Because Games Workshop, in their infinite wisdom, decided not to reinforce a base this size. And with all the crap I'm about to glue to it, I'm a bit worried about it warping. I start by snipping off all the sticky outy bits. Then, I have the utter joy that is cleaning up every single one with a hobby knife. After that, I needed to erase the Games Workshop name from the sprue, but not for the reason you think. Sanding it didn't work, no matter how fast I went, so scraping it is. And I did the same thing with the name under the base. Now here's a hobby hack. I placed the sprue on top of the base and used the base rim as a guide for where to snip off the excess sprue. This only works because the top of the base is smaller than the bottom due to the beveled base rim. There, a nice snug fit. I cement it in place and test it to make sure nothing sticks out beyond the rim. I added supports and gap filled where necessary. Back to the Sreamer, I snip off the original attachment peg in favor of my mega stilt, which is now solidified. I drill a hole in one end of the stilt only to realize the drill is forcing the parts apart. Screw it. Literally. I pinch it closed as the drill tries to split it apart. You might be wondering why I'm using a peg attachment when I'm cementing a plastic-to-plastic bond. The peg will supply a strong connection in the short term, while the cement guarantees one in the long term. Let's attach the body. And yes, I had to drill a third hole. I cut a bit more off the back of the body, and now it's sitting pretty flat. It's looking pretty good. Time to commit and glue the sentinel body to the hoof that's dominating it. With the bod in place, let's take a look at the legs. So, when I was making the copy parts, I think I was envisioning the walker on its other side. As such, I did not make a copy of the left thigh by itself. It's sometimes easier to copy a whole assembly rather than individual parts. This time, however, it did not work out and I have to cut out the left thigh without damaging the other components. This is made trickier by the fact that this is not a straight cut. I got the parts cleaned up and I used a peg to make a working knee joint. The active articulation will help me get the exact right pose before gluing. Plus, it looks really cool. On to the lower leg. I elected not to make a copy since my clay copy technique would likely mess up those double pistons. This means more scratch building. I marked a groove where I should cut this peg, but left it attached to a longer section of peg so I could hold on to it while drilling. Once the piston shaft was cemented in place, I finally snipped the section free. Then, I used the finished piece as a guide to double check the position of the groove for the second one. I cemented the piston shafts on, and while I wait for them to dry, I switch over to sanding the base rim extensions that I glued on off-screen. Here, you can see the difference between the sanded and unsanded sides. When the sanding is complete, I test fit the model onto the base. Then I glue it down using plastic cement for the mega stilt and super glue on the sentinel. Because I'm using super glue on one side, I don't really have the option to slide it around to find the best position. I suppose I could sand down the bottom of the sentinel and glue on a sheet of 0.5mm plastic card for a total cement connection to the base, but that seems like extra work. I go around the walker, applying extra drops of superglue to further anchor it in place, as well as adding this offcut for even more structural integrity. I cement an additional support on the plastic side for similar reasons. After a lot of work, the Sreamer is finally on its base. But let's get back to scratch building the lower leg, cause robo-calves are where it's at. I cement the pistons onto a sheet of plastic card, that way I can poke and prod them into the perfect position. The piston assembly is then glued onto a block of clay. To recreate part of the bottom, I use a section of half-cylinder sprue. It's from the runner of a Kotobukiya kit, though modern Gundam kits from Bandai also have them. The next component is a piece of cardboard from a popcorn box maybe? I glue it on and cut it to size. Sometimes it's faster to attach something and trim it later. That way you don't have to actually measure it. As I was working, I ended up bending one of the pistons out of alignment, so I just need to re-cement it. Careful not to bump the lower piston, I prepared a pin for the top one. This won't be load-bearing, so I figure only one pin will be fine. I tried adding this thin helix piece that my drill produced, but it was too finicky and looked weird, so I removed it. Instead, I made a piece similar to the pistons, but with wire. I bent it into a horseshoe kind of shape and glued it next to the other wire. It's the small details like this that make a piece look detailed. I drilled the upper ankle joint, or lower knee joint depending on your point of view. I carved a notch detail into the end of this peg. This is something I often do on Gundam kits wherever there's an exposed peg in a joint. My plan is to make the upper ankle joint look busted open. I've bent the peg so that one end will be horribly misaligned. The fact that the polymer clay can be bent will aid in this illusion. I'm going to carve a little wedge out of this part. The idea is to make it look like the metal snapped under the tension as the joint buckled when the walker went down. And that's what caused the axle for the joint to pop out of place. Here, I'm adding bits of protruding wire encircling the main axle. I imagine that these were bolts that attached the ball bearing assembly to the joint. Baked more clay. Got some rubber mold parts, but what I'm really after are these blank cylinders. These will be used to make the part at the end of the pistons. I cut off too much of this one, but I have an extra cylinder, so I shaped up another piece and tried again. Then I glued it in place. I feel like I've said that a lot this video. The last major step is to work out the footsies. I like the ankle angle that the molded part already has, but it could be pushed further. Let's tilt these suckers. I glue the ankle joint thingy back on as far to the upper left as possible. Then I trim all the flashing around the complicated geometry. It's not fun, but it has to be done. I fit the feet together because I think it's funny. Then I test them on the respective legs. Now that the whole leg is done, I can finally test fit it to the sentinel body on the base. The right leg doesn't quite fit in the gap between the left and the body though. Well, you know what they say. If your foot's too big, cut off some toes. Speaking of toe detachment, time for some reattachment. I want some of the toes to be drooping down to reinforce the powered down look I'm looking for. I also droop a couple of toes on the other foot. I glue the upper leg halves together with the lower leg in place to ensure that they bend the right amount. Then I glue in the lower leg. To complete the look, I add an armor plate to the knee that I carved from yet another offcut. I don't know what the normal Sentinel knees look like, but this feels right to me. The thigh looks a little naked too, so let's cover that up with another armor plate. It's crazy to think that most of this leg is made of clay. This Sentinel is just about done. I'd glue the legs on right now, but if I did that, then I wouldn't be able to access the rock face for the Sentinel's other leg. The first part of the rock face is the big hunky chunky piece. With that in place, it's a simple matter to fill in the gaps with other textured pieces. I make sure to have the pieces on the edge of the base overhang just a little so they can be trimmed to fit later. This chunk on the back went on nicely. Unfortunately, the base rim is not high enough to match that of the new pieces, so a base rim extension is in order. I bend the extension piece to minimize cleanup later when I have to trim it down. There's a small gap at one end, so I just wedge an offcut in there. I fill the last gap in the stone structure by shoving a clay rock into it. Then I get to trimming the rim. I glued shallow offcuts onto areas to fill small craters before final trim and sanding. Oh, it feels so nice to have a smooth rim. Don't read into that. With the rock face in place, I can finally fill the space on the base by placing the legs in place. Don't haste. I also put a support under the left foot since it's barely touching the base. In preparation for the next step, I use a few chunks of sprue to stop the future foam clay from caving too much into this rock face, as well as this small gap under the back of the walker. I break out the foam clay, which is quite bouncy. I fill the gaps in the previous mentioned places, as well as a few areas around the base to add some visual interest. With that, the Sreamer-Killer is built and done. Well, I still need to add some of those spiky meat plants, but I'm waiting until the clay is fully dried. And since I got the second of 3 big bugs done, let's get back to that millipede. Aw, so cute! I could watch this bendy friend all day. Okay, we're in the final stretch. Only one model left. And what better way to base a big bug than with allied vehicle accessories? It was only $13 too, not bad. Now, I actually bought this for customizing some model tanks, but they should work fine as some guardsman bits. And while I'm rating this kit for their bits, might as well take some from this soldier kit. 10 plastic minis for under $20. Games Workshop could take a cue. Looking at the soldier models, despite them being too tall, their bits are too small. Don't read into that. This is likely due to them having realistic proportions rather than the inflated ones of heroic scale minis. Just look at this guard rifle next to this Tamiya rifle. They are the same length, but the realistic one looks like a totally different scale, even though it's probably the same scale. I also have this kit that I bought long ago for a Gundam conversion, not realizing the bits were too small. I'll take a few things from that one too. I use Oyumaru and make some molds and a bunch of copies. Here are a couple of the copies next to the originals. I also made some rubber molds of a few of the smaller bits. Not sure if I'll use them though. Here, I'm going to delve into my bug basing bit box and pull out some of these clay rods. The skinny one is going to be chopped up and turned into a pair of binoculars. They look about the right size next to this helmet. I make long angled cuts into this rectangular block to carve out the interior of what's going to be a crate. Moving on to another detail, I drill out some rebar that the Psychophage had one of its tentacles wrapped around. Well, I sort of broke the tentacle into pieces while trying to stretch it out, but that's not a problem, because I can just glue it back together around this las rifle. Thing is, I sort of lost the end of the tentacle. Long story short, I made a new end piece out of green stuff, and the bonus is that I got to pose it exactly how I wanted, as opposed to relying on the pre-posed plastic piece. On to the next modification I want to make. These are my sculpting tools. They're just skulls from the Citadel Skulls box mounted on paper clips. I select the ones I want and press them into Oyumaru at different angles. Then I fill them with clay and remove them. These copies don't look too bad, but I think some of the impressions got squished when I pressed multiple impressions into the same piece of thermoplastic. Even though they're a bit elongated, I'll still use them. I originally made these sculpting tools to make custom resin bases without breaking the bank. Those bases were intended for a 1000 Suns force that I wanted to paint, but the amount of work it took to finish these bases was not worth it for the result in my opinion. Anyway, the plan is to scatter the skulls on the bulbous part of the bug's abdomen, so I gotta scrape these veiny veins off. There we go, nice and smooth. The skulls are out of the oven. To help them fit on the convex surface of the abdomen, I drill a shallow hole in the back and carve it wider with my hobby knife. Then I glue them on. I want the skulls to look like they're pressing against the membrane that makes up the walls of the digestion sac. With the skulls stuck in the skull sac, let's gap fill with milliput. I've said it before, but I find milliput slightly annoying to work with. Between having to constantly wipe off my fingers, moisten my tools, and the finite work time, there are a few too many restrictions for me. Plus, it takes many hours for it to harden, as opposed to polymer clay's 15 minutes in the oven, and another 10 for cooling maybe. Well, I couldn't find my actual sculpting tools, so I stuck a piece of Oyumaru on the end of this metal file. But I quickly learned that it was easier just to hold the Oyumaru directly. And now I'm realizing how much of a pain it's going to be, as the milliput would rather stick to the Oyumaru than the intended surface. It's not too bad as long as I keep the makeshift tool moist. 1 skull down, 10 more to go. Eventually, both hemispheres were properly putted. I have some extra mixed milliput, so I stick it in a few choice rubber molds as to not waste it. Despite my intentions, this milliput does not look very smooth to me. Either my put is too old, or I'm not very good at using it. Either way, this GW miniature paint has revealed just how rough the texture truly is. So it's time to try something I've never done before. You know how you can accidentally fill details with thick paint? Yeah, that's what I'm doing. I take some Mod Podge and add just a touch of water. Usually I make this 50-50, but I want this to be thick. Not that thick though. I add a half drop of Citadel paint to color the mixture so I can see where it's been applied. Then I apply it while trying to avoid those succulent skull sculpts. After a few layers, I think the skull sack is sufficiently smoothed. I ended up putting a thinner layer over the skulls to seal the clay. Those skulls look like they've been floating in an ocean of blood. Just wonderful. I also used this mixture to seal the clay las rifle the Psychophage is holding. As it turns out, Mod Podge plus water plus any paint makes for a good wash. A special tip for those who have gotten this far in the video. Seriously, I'm never buying wash again. This stuff is just so affordable. Oh, and if you're wondering how I got the inspiration for the skull sack, it's all because of this detail molded at the bottom of the model. Clearly, this is the skull of the Space Marine the Psychophage was originally devouring. All I did was finish the pattern GW started. While I was handling the model, I sorta broke off the stock of the las rifle and I can't find it. So I'm making a new one. To ensure it doesn't meet the same fate as its predecessor, I pin it with a paperclip. Getting to the base, I just glued a bunch of crap onto it off screen. But it's not just any crap. It's carefully curated crap to create a campsite. As this bug was wandering through the wasteland, it happened upon a camp of sleeping guardsmen. Funny enough, all the campers seem to have disappeared. I wonder where they went. Anyway, I placed most of the supplies around the campfire on the back of the base, and scattered the helmets and some of the guns to show signs of a struggle. One of my favorite details here is resting some of the las rifles on one of the rolled up tarps. To punch up the base detail even more, I add the spikes. Some of these spikes are giving me ship in a bottle vibes, with how far under the bug they are. Especially this one, which had to be impaled on my knife so I could even place it. At the front of the model, I broke off another piece due to handling. This is a can of soup that the Psychophage found and picked up. I think it's really funny. Oh, I seem to have broken it again. I really hope this doesn't keep happening. On to the third to last step of the whole process, applying sand. Normally this is the easy part, but with all of these basing details, working around them is going to be extra fun. Not to mention reaching under the model. Inevitably, I got some sand on a few basing bits. That's no problem, I can knock it off with my knife. Hey knife, knock it off. And now that the third big bug is based, it's millipede time. If pillbugs are like cars, then millipedes are like trains. And who doesn't like trains? Especially when they have mesmerizing legs. I think this is a different millipede than the first one I found. I was concerned that someone might step on this magnificent manifestation of nature, so I moved it off the sidewalk into some grass. Goodbye, little guy. The second to last step, fixing magnets to the bases for transport. I score the base with my knife to increase glue adhesion. I also removed the bump that is on the bottom of Games Workshop bases. For this particular model, it's pinned to the base at one side, so I decide to position the magnet under where the pin is located. This way, the magnet won't bend the model when I pick it up. I sand the top of each magnet and place them onto parchment paper taped over a metal surface. I got the parchment idea from Black Magic Craft. I've tried green stuff and superglue, but hot glue works better than both of those and it's cheaper per volume. Plus, hot glue can be remelted if you screw it up. Though I do want to point out that any magnet will fall off its adhesive if you don't sand them. Anyway, the parchment paper keeps any glue from sticking to the surface, and the metal pulls the magnet in line with the bottom of the base for maximum magnet strength. I double check the flatness of each magnet with a Sharpie. If I don't feel any bumps, the magnet is flush. For smaller models, I use smaller magnets, and the bigger ones get 2 magnets. For the Sreamer-Killer, I test to see if 2 magnets are enough to hold it upside down, which they are. Same with the Psychophage. I now have all of my big bugs based, as well as the small ones. But there's one last step. I have to apply a binding agent to the sand. This is a similar mixture to what I used before, 50-50 Mod Podge and water with a drop or two of paint so I can see it. I think my podge is getting a bit old since I keep finding these coagulated pieces in it. Also, check out these drops of paint. The pigment is spreading out in such a weird way. The cool thing about this step is that it doesn't just bind the sand, but it also seals the polymer clay I used. If I get some on the plastic, it's fine since the water in the mixture keeps it pretty thin. It's a very simple step, but it sure does take a long time on a whole army. If you've made it to the end of this video, thank you for watching. It means a lot to me. And I hope you've gotten some inspiration to complete your own models. Next time, I'll be painting up the whole army. In fact, here's a sneak peek. Until then, have a good one.